It's been a little over a week, and 2 lockouts have passed since Wrath Phase 1 raids opened. And even if week 1 was already a good indicator of how individual specs would perform in raid environment, after the second lockout and more gear obtained, we can see much better how every class would perform going forward. The way we will be looking at it is comparing all the scores on Warcraft logs by individual spec for 80th percentile, which is top 20% logs, which usually include most if not all skilled and geared players, and looking at the individual performance of 100th percentile, the best of the best a class can pull off with all the support it can get, perfect potions, power infusions, unholy frenzies, and whatnot. Starting at the bottom, we have Frost Mages. It's honestly no surprise here, considering Naxxramas is a raid where some bosses have higher frost resistance, and Frost overall not being too good in PvE. Looking at the individual performances, we can see that top performing Frost Mage has done slightly under 6000 DPS throughout all the bosses, with 80th percentile figures hovering at 4.5k, which is a 1.5k DPS drop off from the top. Unsurprisingly, logs with power infusion given to Frost Mages are in single digits, with the first one coming at top 10 with 5.3k DPS at item level 204. Just forget about Frost, this is not the spec for raiding. Above Frost Mages, with a slightly exceed Arms Warrior, with the top one pumping out 5900 DPS and making around 5k DPS at 80th percentile. While the top performance is on par with the Frost Mage, the average is a little bit higher, with over 500 DPS above Frost at 80th percentile. And the lower you go, the bigger the difference will be. Going up, with a 3-point lead and a total of 681 logs, we have Subtlety Rogues. With the top 1 performer making 5300 DPS, it's hard to say why they sit on top of Frost Mages and Arms Warriors with only 20 public logs of completed raids. It's likely that individual boss performance is skewing the data towards rogues here. Anyway, a pure PvP spec not performing well in PvE. Shocking. Going up, we have Fury Warriors. With a 100th percentile performance of 6900 DPS and 80th percentile hovering around 5200, it is evident that Fury is very dependent on gear, buffs, procs and crits. In later phases, with better gear, Fury will shine, like they always do near the end of the expansion. But for now, they're comfortably sitting at 4th place from the bottom, slightly above their brothers in arms. Beastmaster Hunter is the first hunter spec we see, sitting at the bottom 5. With the top performance of 6100 DPS and 80th percentile hovering at 4500, it's unclear why Warcraft logs place them above Fury while they arguably perform worse by every metric. But that's what we have. They might perform better on individual bosses, and that's where difference may come from, but judging by complete raid numbers, BM Hunter performs worse on average than Fury Warriors, even if they score higher. Going up, we have the flavor of the TBC, Wrath expansion, Paladins. All the Paladin rerollers coming to the raid are ought to be disappointed by their performance, with the 100th percentile at slightly under 6500 DPS and 80th percentile sitting around 5500 DPS. It is still an alright number, but with Naxxramas favoring Paladin damage, it's unlikely that things will change much in Ulduar. For Paladins to really shine, they would need tier 10 2-piece bonus. Until then, their single target damage will stay subpar. Next comes Feral Druid. With 7k DPS at 100th percentile and 5700 at 80th percentile, they don't perform all that great if you consider how many things you have to keep track of while playing Feral. Of course, with more gear they will definitely shine and go to the top, but for now, it's not a huge return of investment. Sitting above them is our first proper caster, a Shadow Priest. Making 7600 DPS at 100th percentile and averaging 6000 at 80th percentile, it's a respectable performance metric, but it's unclear how much of that performance is thanks to the troll racial feature. But hey, as long as they perform fine, who cares, right? Elemental Shaman, caster kings of PvP, perform roughly on par with Shadow Priests. With a good burst and not that good sustained damage, their numbers are similar to Shadow Priests, but with the lower amount of logs they sit slightly above with a better average. Marksmanship Hunters fall under the same category as the two classes above, with 7100 DPS at 100th percentile and 5800 DPS at 80th percentile. If we go lower than 80 percentile, the falloff in DPS is lower than Shamans and Shadow Priests, and thanks to this consistency, Marksman Hunters are ranked slightly above those two. Fire Mage is our first proper mage spec at 12th place. With 7300 DPS at 100th percentile and 5800 at 80 percentile, they do comparable damage to previously mentioned classes, but they do it much more consistent, with no steep drop-off going from 100 percentile to 99 and lower. They scale a lot with crit, so it's not really surprised that they rank lower than other casters, although they will truly shine later on. Not quite breaking top 10 is Balanced Druid. Finally, after 2 expansions of limited viability, they are allowed to be middle of the pack. Top performer making slightly under 7400 DPS is only a 50 DPS increase over top 2 performer, who in turn only did 80 more DPS than top 3. The numbers are very consistent, with 80 percentile coming at 6500 DPS and 50 percentile sitting at 6k DPS. Balanced Druid proves to be a very consistent performer who barely misses the big boys club. The one who does make it though is Arcane Mage. With pretty short fights, Arcane Mages don't get to struggle with mana, which make them able to show their true potential. Unfortunately, their true potential is pretty limited about what they get to take in terms of cooldowns and crits. While the top performer is getting 8k DPS, the 80th percentile are sitting at 6600 DPS, which is around the Balanced Druid performance. Sitting above mages is a Survival Hunter. With the top performance at 7500 DPS, there is no steep drop-off down as there is with Arcane Mages, which indicates more consistency in the spec. And with the 80th percentile offering the same 6600 DPS as Arcane Mages, they're roughly on par, with Hunters being more consistent and Mages having a bigger peak. Going up, we have the first representative of Warlock, being Destruction. With a 100 percentile getting slightly over 7500 DPS and 80 percentile sitting around 5800, Destruction Warlocks show to be pretty inconsistent and somewhat lackluster at the top 20% spot. Although the lower you go, the more consistent the damage gets, it just proves that the spec is pretty limited in terms of what you can get out of it. Going forward, we get to Frost Death Knights. Frost Death Knights, being less gear dependent than warriors, outperform them by a long shot, but Frost especially scale worse than the former, so if you're a Frost Death Knight, it's your time to shine. Being heavily dependent on fairly frequent procs, they show somewhat consistent performance with top 3 players making the same 7500 DPS and top 20% sitting at 6700 DPS. Sitting above them is another dual wielder, a Combat Rogue. With the top performer making 300 more DPS than the second best at 7600 DPS and falling off to 6200 DPS, it shows to be pretty inconsistent, but the damage normalizes when you go below top 20%. With this normalization, and having a quarter of Frost Death Knight logs, they sit only slightly above them while making less DPS in the 80th percentile. Now, breaking top 5 is an Enhancement Shaman. With the top performer breaking the 8k DPS barrier, the second best is sitting on an entire 350 DPS deficit compared to the first one, and top 10 at 7200 DPS. 80th percentile showing a consistent 6500 DPS, and this is what we could roughly expect to see in an average rate. Top 4 performer, Unholy Death Knight, is an unusual one. With the top performers getting 8400 DPS, Unholy Death Knights sit at the top in the 95 percentile bracket, but going down to 80 percentile, Unholy falls into the 4th place. Heavily dependent on trinket procs in the beginning of the fight, before popping Gargoyle, the difference can be massive, and it shows, with top 20% performers making 700 to 7100 DPS. Top 3 spot is occupied by Assassination Rogue. With top 10 performers having a 400 DPS spread It's pretty consistent, but also relies pretty heavily on trinket procs and crits. 80 percentile sit on 7100 to 7200 in under 200 average item level gear. It proves to be pretty strong, although it scales worse in combat, which will outperform Assassination later on. And finally, in the top 2 spots we have 2 Warlock specs, Affliction and Demonology. Trading blows between each other, Affliction sits at the very top of the game in a 100 percentile bracket with 8700 DPS, which rapidly falls off in 95 percentile with the second best performer making 450 DPS less than the top performer. Demonology, on the other hand, is more consistent with lower numbers in 99 percentile at 8100 DPS and fallen to 7600 in top 95 percentile, which is the same as Affliction numbers. Looking at the 80 percentile figures, they are also roughly the same, being 7100 DPS, but Demonology being more consistent between individual performers. So there we have it, Week 2 summary of Phase 1 Wrath Raiding. While the individual numbers might change with more gear, the upgrades are not big enough to impact the current standings in a meaningful way. Thank you guys for watching, leave a like if you liked the video, subscribe if you wanna see more videos like this, and I'll see you all in the next one.